So till now we saw different types of event binding like string interpolation, property binding, and recently we saw event binding. All these are one-way data binding, either from TypeScript or to HTML or from HTML to TypeScript. But we also have two-way data binding. Like, to continue with the last example wherein we had this text box, and while typing we can see the result coming on the console. I type something and I click again, I get that on console. Instead of having this on console, I can have the same coming on DOM. And see, all this wiggly line is because of the TS lint, wherein you have this semicolon and single quote. Semicolon and single quote, you can make this as false and save it. You see, now it's not a problem. And so instead of having it displayed on console, what I'll do is I'll say this dot the property title equal to event dot target dot value. Now I'll save it and I'll have string interpolation again, and I'll say title and save this. Now initially app, if I type something, it's not assigned, or when I click on it, then you see coming on the screen. Or to have it the right at that moment, I'll change the event type and I'll say key press. I'll save this now. Now see, so this is called as two-way data binding. I pass in the information, at the same time I get the information back to the view. This is called as two-way data binding. And to perform two-way data binding, Angular gives a better way, which is called as ng model. When I use ng model, which is placed in both event and property binding, you say ng model equal to the property title. Now I don't need any of this. I'll simply remove it and I'll comment this out because I don't need any of these, and I'll save it, but I'll end up with an error. The error is ng model isn't a known property of input. So ng model is something that is given by Angular, and currently Angular doesn't recognize this because I am not including from where ng model comes from, and that I need to include in root module. I need to say from where that comes. It comes from forms module. Oops, forms module, and I need to involve that, import forms module from Angular forms. Now save it. And see, there is no problem. You see, when I say, so ng model is something that is well used for two-way data binding. The moment you type something, it is assigned to the property and you straight away display it on the DOM. So this is called as ng model. ng model is given by Angular. It is called as a directive, and to use ng model you need to import forms module and need to register forms module in imports array. Imports is an array that takes the list of all modules that we use, and these modules could be given by Angular or some other party, or even created on our own. But whatever the case may be, if you are using a module, you need to list it in imports. And we'll see how a component can be created and how two components can be made in a parent and child relationship. So index.html as usually holds the root component. We don't change anything over there, and in root component we'll place a custom component, and to do that I need the console, and I'll split the screen. Now I'll come into cd source app and I'll create a directory, and I'll place all the components inside this. And when you can use Angular CLI to create a component, and also when a component is created, observe the root module. In here I can say ng generate, you can have the full word generate, or g component, and the component name, let that be component 1, and you press enter and see. So it created 4 files as we saw in the initial introduction part. For every component it has 4 files, and also what it do, it update app module, and see, this is how we register a component, a custom component in the root module. If you use Angular CLI, all this will happen automatically. Likewise, I'll go for creation of another component. So I have component 1 and component 2 created. Now what I'll do is, app component 1 I can place in the root component, I can place app dash component 1. How do I get this one? You can open the component 1 TypeScript. I'll open it from here, components, component 1 TypeScript, and this is the selector using which I can represent this entire component in app component. Now if I have 2 over here, now I call these 2 as siblings. They are in sibling relationship. But if I say, I'll cut this out and I'll open app component HTML, and now I'll say component 2, and I'll save both the files. Component 1 has component, okay, and I better have this one as it is for your understanding purpose. Okay, so if you place component 2 in component 1 HTML or component 2 next to component 1 in the root component, you don't see any change in the output. But to show it in a pictorial way, I can take up something like this, but this is again for your understanding purpose. In general, we don't go for showing it like this all the time. And I say I don't need this time, rather I'll have a div. Now I'll color them. Style equal to background color. I'll say aqua, and width 200 pixel, height 200 pixel. Likewise, the same thing I'll try to have it over here, but 100 pixel and 100 pixel and a different color. Let that be blue violet, and save the files. Now you see, this is component 1 and this is component 2. So component 2 is inside component 1. Now if I get all this next to component 1, how do you imagine the picture? Component 1 and component 2. Component 2, I didn't save it actually. Now if you see, component 1 and component 2. So that's how you can show the relation as siblings or parent and child. Siblings, you can have both the components in one HTML file. But if you get this component inside app component 1's HTML file, then you call it as parent and child relationship. We'll arrange them in parent and child relationship like they are already arranged, and then we'll try to pass a value from parent to child. So we have them in parent and child relationship. Yes, app component holds component 1 and component 1 holds component 2. So I'll be using component 1 TypeScript now. Likewise, component 2 HTML and TypeScript. So people often complain about getting confused when I toggle between these 4 files. I'll do my best to explain the concept. Let us have a property. My prime intention is to pass a value from parent component to child component. So I'll say, I'll have a p tag and I'll say parent component, and parent component, I'll put this just above the div, and this is parent component. In parent component, let me have a variable or property. I'll say component 1 property of type string, which holds some value like component 1 value. I'll save this one, and I did not display it anywhere. Now my intention is to have this value, component 1 value, getting displayed in component 2, and component 2 I'll say component parent, and I'll say child component. That's it. Now how can I pass this information? This is the property of component 1. So properties, you know, can be placed over here. For input text box, we have value, something like this, value equal to, and the property, which is this one, component 1 property. But for component 2, we do not have anything called as value as its property. So we'll declare a property for component 2 and call it as component 2 property of type string. Again, I'll save this, and what I'll do, I'll say component 2 property, and this is property binding. So what I'm trying to do in here is, if you remember the input type example wherein I said input type equal to text and value equal to component 1 property, and I made it a property binding. When I did this, the value available in component property is what you see in the text box. If I remove it, you'll see the same text coming on screen. So now the value available in this property or in this variable, I'm trying to pass it to component 2. To receive this, I need a property available in component. Once I receive it, I'll say console, rather than having console log, will directly say component 2 property. We did a template component 2, since it isn't a known property of app component. So the problem we see over here is it says component 2 prop isn't a known property of app component 2. It is unable to identify this as its property, and to make this happen, what you need to do is decorate it with @input, and @input comes from Angular core. Now save it. So you see component 1 value, which is the data that we have given in component 1, is now available in child component. So this is how you can pass the property of component using property binding. The value, this entire text component 1 value, you are assigning it to component 2 property, and to receive it you need a component 2 property. Above that it should be decorated with input. So in one word, when you want to pass information from parent to child, you use property binding and @input. In the next session we'll see how I can pass data from child component to parent component.